Okay. Good evening. Thank you. And welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Andrew Rutledge, Bentley historian and research associate, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight to the historic Detroit Observatory, a division of the Bentley. I also want to welcome our audience watching online. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here on this, well, actually rather pleasant spring evening after the last couple of weeks, so we did well there. But tonight we have a really exciting and I think really timely presentation. For 2025 is the 175th anniversary of the University of Michigan Medical School. And since opening its doors in 1850, Michigan medicine has many achievements of which it is justly proud, such as opening the first university-owned and operated hospital in 1869 and pioneering the clinical clerkship in 1899, transforming medical students from passive observers to active participants in the healing and learning processes. Now, without a doubt, the medical school at Michigan has led the way in discovering the cause of diseases, developing innovative tools and techniques for improving health, and training generations of scientists and healers. And like any organization, or any individual for that matter, Michigan medicine has crafted a set of stories that it tells about itself. And these stories about its history and achievements have been crafted both consciously and unconsciously from a variety of motives and have changed and rechanged over the years. But as our speaker tonight, Dr. Tanya Neff-Chang, will reveal, those institutional narratives have often erased the experiences of Black medical students, particularly those who attended Michigan in the school's early years of the 19th and early 20th century. In particular, she will show us tonight how power has influenced the making and remaking of those historical accounts and how these hidden histories remained embedded in everyday spaces on the university's campus to this day. Dr. Tanya Neff-Chang is an interdisciplinary historian whose work explores how race and racism have shaped our educational and medical institutions. After receiving her undergraduate degree at the University of California, Berkeley, she earned a master's in educational leadership and policy and a PhD in educational foundations here at the University of Michigan. Currently, she is a postdoctoral researcher at the Community-Based Research on Equity, Activism, and Transformative Education Center in the Marshall Family School of Education, and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Access, and Justice Instructional Lead at the Michigan Medical School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tanya Neff-Chang.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for setting the stage. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. You know, your time is your most precious resource, and I'm so grateful that you've chosen to take tonight to learn a little bit about this history. And I think you'll also learn a little bit about what happens when an educator blends with a historian. So we're going to be doing some fun things tonight, even though the topic itself explores a lot of challenging and hard topics. So I'm calling it tonight The Stories We Tell, Making Historical Memory at Michigan Medicine. And thanks to my partner who lets us know that we should always have objectives to let you know the journey that you're about to go on. We're going to consider some institutional master or grand narratives. We're going to then nuance these narratives by censoring, not censoring, the opposite, centering those who have been erased, silenced, or kept on the margins. And then we're going to examine the relationship of space to institutional narratives and explore countermapping and other more expansive institutional histories, some of which folks in this room have engaged in. So I'm very excited to connect those kinds of works. All right, so let's start. Yeah, we're going to start right away with this idea about America's historical narrative. And as many of these headlines are suggesting, it's contested. All of these headlines are coming from the last 5 years. So I took them from 2020 to 2025, so you can see the last one. And they are covering a range of perspectives as well. People are saying it's not the right who are challenging history. Nope, it's the left. It's Trump. No, it's liberals. So there's always been a push and pull. And I want to add one on top of that. because this is also connected to the institutional history news that came out today that is about shaping our narratives, that has to do with how we understand who we are, where we're going, who's included, who belongs, who doesn't belong. And as you can see, that came to me when I was putting this together, I don't know, about 40 minutes ago, 50 minutes ago. So narrative. What is narrative? Narratives generally are understood as the stories, the kinds of things that we might tell about places, people, and things. And one thing I really, really appreciate about history is that even though I've given you these narratives that come from the last 5 years, these kinds of contestations of the historical narrative are as long and wide as the US is a nation. So if we take, for example, Dr. David Blight, who is the current president of the Organization of American Historians, one of the things he talks about is, after the Civil War, the kinds of negotiation for how we would understand what happened in the Civil War. And he talks about how the Civil War narrative became this harmonious forgetfulness. Think about that. Harmonious forgetfulness. What does that even mean? It means that there are going to be things that we remember, and there are going to be things that we forget. And by the we, I mean the collective we. So part of what we'll do tonight is think about how does that happen individually, how does that happen collectively, and how do we apply that to the institution. So the teacher in me is going to now take you through a little activity that some of you may have done when you were in, when you were in kindergarten or elementary school. So I want you all to do a little imagination exercise, okay? So we're going to do this silently. I'll walk you through it, but I want you just to think about who you might imagine if you think about a mother. Okay? Got your mother image in your mind? Imagine now a teacher. Who are they? How about a nurse? How about a physician? All right. Very quick. You all have your 4 imaginings? All right. So now let's think about what you notice about the imaginings. I would venture to say there's probably some aspect of gender, right? You might, for your mothers, maybe some of you thought of your own mother, or maybe you thought of yourself as a mother, or maybe you thought of some larger mother, Mother Earth. Teacher, perhaps something similar, a gendered, maybe even a racial, maybe something connected to your own experience, maybe something good, maybe something bad. Similarly, a nurse and a physician. So part of what we want to do in this exercise, this is not about shaming, because I would imagine that somebody in this room probably thought of somebody and then immediately turned and thought about somebody else, just because you knew that there was something about this activity that we're trying to subvert. That's okay too, because that's part of understanding that narratives are connected to how we imagine the world. Okay, so I now want to present to us a little metaphor, and I'm going to do it through the use of AI, our favorite wild little tool, okay? I don't know if some of you have been playing with AI, but I certainly have. And so I wanted to think about AI as a kind of metaphor for our collective imaginings. So if we were to think about how AI might imagine a nurse, say, in the 17th century. This is what AI, a 17th century nurse. Here is an 18th century nurse. So I'm changing the century each time. A 19th century nurse. A 20th century nurse. Now I'm going to guess that many of you are probably noticing a few things, yes? Certainly we can see clearly that there is a gendered component. Seems like there could be a race component, although race in a photo, it's not always easy to know what people's racial backgrounds are if they don't self-identify them. Something I was surprised by, and I wonder if anybody else is kind of as you move closer to the 20th century, they get sexier. I wasn't prepared for sexy nurse, but perhaps I should be, because this is our collective imaginings. And the collective imaginings are coming from a set of inputs and stories. that come from literature, that come from popular media, that come from stories in our family, that come from how we move in the world. Okay, so now let's see what this looks like with the physician. So let's do the same thing. Here we have a 17th century physician, an 18th century physician, a 19th century physician, and a 20th century physician. So there's some interesting things you're probably noticing as well, right? So now we see a different gendered component. I think we can clearly see that. Probably race. It's harder to tell with some of these photos, as you'll see in some of the photos I share later about Michigan medical students. Something I noticed is this level of activity. There's things happening, measurements, books, laughter, I don't know, revelry, probably some drunkenness. They're not always alone. I thought that was pretty interesting. So here we have these imaginings. And a question I'd like to pose to you all is, what happens if what we imagine is not what we encounter? How do we reconcile it? What does that mean for how we engage? What does that mean for how we treat somebody? And that's an important question to ask because our imaginations are not just up here in some abstract space. They have real consequence. If you imagine that someone is dangerous or something is dangerous, you'll act accordingly. You'll change your behavior to map onto that. So that's part of why we're doing this. But I wanted to take this a little further. So let's see what happens in the 21st century. Can AI be better as our collective imagination metaphor? Oh, here's a 21st century physician, another 21st century physician, another one, and very classically AI, cutting off the head. There's always one. I believe there was one in the nurses as well. So I found this also very interesting. So you have similarly gendered, 100% seemingly male gender, a little bit of racial difference. But I wanted to then look at what does the data say? If we actually look at what the percentages of physicians are in the US, what would that look like? Can AI compare with the data? So let's look at what we'd call concordance or representation in the medical profession. This data comes from 2018. This is from the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges. And the pie chart on the left is showing the representation by race. And what we can see very largely is 56.2% is represented by white. And what was the representation in our collective imaginings from our friend AI? 100%. 100%. That's a huge disparity between this narrative understanding of what a physician could be or who it should be or who it might be versus even in this problematic data. So this data is definitely problematic. It's showing that we have issues with representation because it's not proportional, at the very least, to what our what the society is. So the next biggest one is 17.1%. I suppose you could say that's close, and that's Asian. And then 13.7 is unknown, so that could cover any number of things. And then you see the 5 and 5.8%, you have Black or African American and Hispanic. So even with 10% being Black, African American, or Hispanic, did we see any of that in our collective imaginings? No. And I think it's powerful because sometimes that's exactly how our humanity is acting. That is exactly how our institution narratives might be perceived. So let's look at the other graph, which is on the right-hand side, and this is looking at gender. So it's not exactly 50-50, but did we see any male nurses? No. And we definitely didn't see any female doctors, right? So these narratives and the data, as problematic as the data is, are not matching. And so part of what this is designed to show is what we like to call, and by we, I mean me and my good friend, Toni Morrison, who coined what I like to think of as the master narrative. And so I don't know if she coined it, but she certainly talked about it through all of her works. And so that is that there's this idea about what is natural, what is right, what is valued, and it's deeply connected to the racialization of our history. And of course, she's writing in a literary sense, and so she's really looking at how that happens in the imagination in the literary sense. And as a historian, I like to fold that in as I think about the development of institutions, including Michigan Medicine. All right, y'all, this is a historian. Clearly, clearly. Okay, but outside of the gender, that's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. My office looks exactly like that. But then I wanted to show midwives too. And so even though this might be a kind of a light activity to help us think through what narratives are and how they might be generated, by the way, this was coming from Midjourney. And Midjourney initially trained its AI tools on 16,000 images, photographs, paintings. I don't think they asked for permission, for copyright, yet another problematic thing. But it's interesting because who's selecting these 16,000 bits of information to feed to a machine in order for the machine, to figure out how to represent these things? And so the next question I ask is, who is missing? And what happens when this is the narrative that we hold that doesn't even correspond with what the data is? And so let's move away from AI and look at some actual images. And these are Black nurse and nurse midwives in the early 20th century. And at the moment, none of them are representing Michigan. But part of what we're going to do tonight in this talk is make connections between Michigan as an institution and the world in which Michigan and its students and its faculty and staff are situated. And so I wanted to show this because much of the narrative around who is a nurse and who is a doctor doesn't always represent this. And that is intentional. It's intentional in how medical schools developed. It's intentional in how nursing programs developed. It's even intentional in how licensure developed. In early antebellum, which would be pre-Civil War days when racialized slavery was part of how the United States was operating, there were plenty Black nurses and midwives who were constantly tending, who were doing the work of healing. And one of the things that happened post-Civil War was the development of licensure. So states would determine, states or professional organizing bodies, would determine who was able to practice in the profession. And they were also able to determine what the standards were. And it was not Black women who were determining what those standards were. In general, it would have been white men and white women. And that continued racialization happened throughout the South, but also throughout the North. And so when I say South and North, that's also an implication of space. So that's why we're thinking about the spatial. So it's not just states, but it's where we are, where we're situated, where we're located, and how the space is also constructing how we understand the narratives and the stories that we tell. Okay, so I'm going to offer just a little bit more context before I jump into Michigan Medicine. And I want to start with a historian's favorite tool, and that's a timeline. Do you all recognize this gentleman? This is Dr. James McCune Smith. He is known as the first African American to have a licensed medical degree, but he didn't get his medical degree in the United States. He wasn't accepted. He wasn't allowed. As a Black man, he would not be accepted to any white institutions, and so he went to Glasgow. He got his medical degree. He actually got his bachelor's there as well, and he came back to the United States and was in New York. He opened what they called at the time the Colored Orphans Asylum. That was a term that they were using in the the 1840s. And he was the physician there. So he was working with Black children who had been orphaned, and it also served as a school. That school, unfortunately, later got burned down in some race riots. So it was really sad, and it was connected to people who didn't want to fight in the war. They felt that it wasn't their fight, and part of what these predominantly Irish people like to classify the folks who were fighting against this draft, because they said that they were being recruited into a war that wasn't for them. And so a lot of destruction happened in New York and across several cities prior, so it was around 1863. So the next one, we don't actually have we don't actually have a picture of Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, and so I would ask if any of you are interested and you decide to Google and there is a picture, you should use some critical thinking and be like, but is that really her, or did somebody just say it is and now it's been repeated over the internet 500 times and so we believe it. But we do have this book that she wrote, and Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, she became the first female Black medical doctor in 1848. So again, we're talking pre-Civil War. So this is an incredible accomplishment. And I want us to understand that because when we talk about firsts, which is another kind of common narrative for Black physicians, Black healthcare professionals, I think we could complicate and nuance that a little bit. So I wanted to talk about now Susie King Taylor. Do you all know, have you heard of Susie King Taylor? She was fabulous. So she was enslaved, escaped enslavement during emancipation, and went to Union camps. And those Union camps were also known as contraband camps. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the term. So people who were emancipated, but because the Civil War was still going on, they weren't given their citizenship yet. They were considered contraband, which is connected now to property. So people weren't sure to do them, but she, in these camps, was an educator, she was a nurse, she was a patriot. She's known for carrying her gun around and also being a healer. So she had this very storied account, and she wrote her autobiography, which is part of the reason why we were able to know some of her story. And again, this is somebody who's part of the nursing tradition and should be part of the narrative when we talk about who are nurses, what is the history of nurses in the United States. And here we have the Freedmen's Hospital, which is now called Howard University Medical Hospital. So this is when it was founded. So it was also founded during the Civil War, while the Civil War was ongoing. And this was one of two hospitals that managed to survive. Oh, thank you. For, just give me 1 second. There we go. I'm not sure. Yeah. So I'll just tell you that it managed to survive when a kind of 19th or 20th century, so early 1900s standards-based reform movement is how I would think about it, with the Flexner Report. And so Howard Medical School stood, and it was one of the few places where Black doctors, Black medical students, and Black patients were treated, were leaders, and it's a major part of the story. Okay. So now we're getting into some things that are also connecting to the history of Michigan medicine. So on the left, you see Dr. Sophia B. Jones. She was the first Black female graduate at the University of Michigan. And then on the, did I say the left? I meant the right. On the left, we see Dr. Sarah Logan Fraser. And so she was another early Black woman medical professional. And one of the reasons why I wanted to pair them together was not just because we should be thinking about and centering Black women's narratives, but also because one of the stories about Dr. Sarah Fraser, was that she was later erased from case studies as part of her institution because the white women that she worked with were afraid that if people saw them as integrationists, it would have impact on their careers. Kind of some salience and how that continues to be represented, that people fear what happens when you're associated with something connected to race, and then they make changes like this. And this change was very intentionally erased. They erased her and her work. At Michigan Medicine, one of our first Black enrollees was also erased from the narrative until recently, actually. A lot of incredible work has been done to reintroduce Dr. Tucker. But he came to Michigan Medicine. He was heckled and gravely mistreated. And when he talked to the registrar, one of the things that they mentioned was, well, you know, maybe you're causing a little bit too much trouble, so you should go. And they refunded his money and scrubbed him from the records. And something I think about for this story is that there were certainly people, the early medical students were kind of known as being a bit wild. And there were certainly people who didn't want him to be there because he was black. But not everybody had that sentiment. But it was those who had the sentiment who got the action done. Yet those without the sentiment still contributed to the consequence of that, which I think is another kind of salient point around history, that the silences also have impacts. And this impacted his erasure. So here we have the National Medical Association. I don't know how many of you know. There's the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association. American Medical Association was founded in 1848. This one was 1895. Part of the reason this is founded so late is because so many black physicians were trying to enter the American Medical Association and were constantly being thwarted, denied, some very overtly because of their race, some out of administrative protocol. And so I wanted to bring up Dr. Boyd because Dr. Boyd actually did study at Michigan Medicine. He didn't graduate here, but he did some of his special training. And so this is a really powerful connection, I think, to the people who were coming to Michigan to learn, to study, to interact and engage, did incredible things. And I think we should elevate those stories. And here's the last one for this. It's the Black Hospitals Movement. So remember I mentioned earlier this kind of report that came out that determined there had to be certain standards for particular hospitals. Michigan Medicine standard was pretty good. Most black medical hospitals were determined not to be good. So there were about 8, and 6 of those 8 closed as a consequence, and 2 of them survived, Meharry and Howard. And so part of this movement were what people would refer to as self-help, people coming together to do what they needed to do for their communities, for themselves, to advance themselves professionally. These are professionals who were brilliant and doing amazing things, and they wanted to improve. So now let's think about the narrative of Michigan medicine, if it goes through. Okay, so a familiar image, yes? We have the Old Main Hospital. The medical school opened in 1850, so before the Civil War. And if any of you has anybody been to the medical school and walked through the halls? Oh my goodness, some of you have. You have to do it, right? You have to. You have to go and walk through the halls. It is a treasure trove of artifacts. So many of the things that I'll show you today are photos that I've taken because they're out on display. They're there for us to engage with and to think about, and it's terrific. So here we have the medical school, and this chart here, I apologize, I know it's not very exciting, but it's something about the narrative. So most black physicians and nurses went to all black hospitals and medical schools to be trained. Some say it's usually around 60% of all. But there were some that also went to what we would call predominantly white institutions, Harvard, Pennsylvania, Michigan. So what this chart shows is that if most students are going to Howard and Meharry, next is Harvard, or no, what does it say? Yep, next is Harvard, and after that is Michigan. So it's a kind of an interesting dynamic that while the institution itself did not have many in terms of numbers, it was known as a receiver, as a place where black men and women could be educated. And I was recently reading a set of objectives that Dr. Yancey, who was a graduate here, and I'll talk about him later, was writing to students in the 1960s. And one of the objectives that he included, medical student objectives, was do not take no for an answer. And I just thought that was fascinating because I think it really spoke to a cultural element that connects to the persistence that these folks had to continue with. Okay, so some of you, if any of you saw the flyer for this talk, I love the flyer for this talk. So this is the class of 1880. And in the flyer, there's kind of an image of somebody who's missing. And one of the doctors, and I wasn't totally sure if they're in there. I don't know, Andrew, if you happen to know. But I wanted to tell you just the story first of Samuel LeCount Cook. So he graduated in 1880. And he has one of the most fascinating histories. And I want to start with his father. So his father was born enslaved, and so was his aunt. But his aunt, she was a bit of a hustler. She was an entrepreneur. And one of the things, even though that she was enslaved, she was able to do something called hiring out her time. So in other words, she would take her free time, whatever that was, and go and do things that could earn her income. She was also incredible at growing vegetables, and so she sold them. So she managed to bring in money, and over her time in life, she could buy the freedom for 22 of her relatives. So this is an incredible part of the story that is connected to this Michigan medicine graduate. One of those people that she bought the freedom for was Reverend Cook, who was Dr. Samuel Cook's father. And he was an abolitionist. His father was an abolitionist. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he ended up marrying one of the elite of the Philadelphia families. And so this was known, they were kind of an upper class black family at sort of around the turn of the century. And perhaps one of the reasons that's one of the reasons that enabled Dr. Cook to come to Michigan Medicine, is that they had some means for him to travel and to be here. And I wanted to juxtapose this. So these bulletins are also treasure troves. If anybody has been to the Bentley, fabulous site, the bulletins that just tell us about the history of the medical school from the institutional perspective. It gives the curriculum. It tells you who the faculty are. It tells you what's acceptable. It has the honor codes. And I just wanted to show the admission of women, because one of the things that is very important about Michigan Medicine is that it did accept women, and accepted women pretty early. It's one of the first institutions to accept women. And that's important, and I think we should always elevate that. And I think we should also think about, still, what was it like to be a woman? What was it like to be a black woman? And we have fewer accounts of that, but we do know that some of the early women who were here were not treated very well. They were heckled. When Dr. Amanda Sanford, she was the first woman who graduated in 1871, went to get her letter, she was reading her letter to be matched to her institution, they threw slips of paper at her. She wasn't allowed to be in the class photo, which they subsequently did again in the next couple of years. But eventually the women made it into the photo, and so there are women in this photo. But I just love when you read the language here that says, mostly they can be together, but sometimes they need to be separate. So instruction was separate, especially for anatomy. And when they weren't together, and if any of you have seen Dr. Joel Howe's talk, he spoke last year, I think, he has a great image that just shows the separation, and they used to have a nice red line that just said women over here and men over here. And so it's an interesting component for thinking about gender. And so while Michigan did accept gender, there were a lot of people who did not accept women. In fact, when I looked back at records that were recounting how women came to University of Michigan in the 1940s, they described it as feminist agitation. Agitation being another word for protesting. That's right. I see a couple of fists in the air. That's right. Feminist agitation. So what does that mean? That means that these women were advocating. That means that people were out there saying, listen, you need to let us in. And they did. But it took work and it took effort. And I think that should be represented. Dr. Kathleen Crawford, she is known because she practiced in Ann Arbor. Maybe some of you know about Dr. Kathleen Crawford. And so here we have the women of her class in 1898, and then a 40th reunion, which I think is just fabulous, because this is one of the ways that people continue to be connected to the university and to each other. And something that I think is really interesting about how Kathleen describes her experience is that she always talked about how important the common goal was, the common goal of medicine, of learning with each other, and how that just kept her connected to her classmates. And then she also reflected later in a survey that I believe is Bentley historians they sent it out to some of the early students at the University of Michigan. And her reflections then said, it was wonderful, I had a lot of great times, but there were also a lot of bitter times and a lot of things that still make me sad even after all of this time, almost a quarter of a century. And so I think that's something too, is how does an institution grapple with people who can be proud of where they go, who can love their institution deeply, who can grow and who have gotten so much from the institution, but who also have pain, who also have suffered. I think both of those things often exist at the same time, and it can be really challenging, I think, for institutions and perhaps even broader people in general to accept those things that happen at the same time. So this I want to share. This is a fun little poem. So this comes from the reunion of the class of 1864. So women were not admitted to the university until 1870. So I just thought I would read what this gentleman is reflecting with his other classmates, and who were also gentlemen. And he says, "We had the lectures to ourselves, but now co-eds are here to cheer them in their vacant hours and banish every fear. They all have tasks to do the same, and much real progress show, but not more so than those who left more than 40 years ago." So it's a little cheeky. It's a little. If you read the poem in its entirety, there's a lot that this alum is calling out, naming the professors as kind of tired now and slowing down, and so it seems to be a reflection. But it did strike me that something about the recognition of co-edness, of going to school with women, was different, and they were reflecting on that. But also maintaining this idea that, you know, we're the best. We were the best because we were here, and I thought it was really interesting. I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of the things I always like to do, because I think history is so big and broad, and there are so many moments of policy that connect to these stories and that have implications, and sometimes I think we can forget that they're happening at the same time. And so as I'm describing people who were graduating at the University of Michigan in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I wanted you just to see that there were also these larger national struggles for civil rights in the late 1880s. So there was the first Civil Rights Act that gave equal access to accommodations in 1875, which was then repealed by 1883 when a change of political governance came into place. In 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese people from coming unless they had some kind of connection to a particular form of labor that was going to be acceptable. For example, merchants sometimes could get around that. Plessy versus Ferguson, so the separate but equal. This is a really important one. Eugenics. This is something that's also connected to a way of thinking that there were many faculty on campus who believed this idea that some people are inferior to others, and for those who are inferior, they shouldn't be able to breed, to use that term. And we know that it had ramifications for how Nazis then later used it to great violence. So the Flexner Report I mentioned to you all, another Immigration Act. So you can see these kinds of things are happening. Women getting the right to vote, all of these things. So now I want to tell you about Dr. Simon Lewis Carson. So another Ann Arborite. Perhaps you've met him. If any of you haven't gone on the African American tour of Ann Arbor and Ypsi, you have to do it. You have to do it. It's fabulous. And if you are really just can't get enough, then you also need to go to Detroit and you do a tour with Jamon Jordan, because they're all fabulous and they will just open your eyes to the very vibrant kinds of histories that are all around us, but that we don't often see until you hear about it, and then it gives you another kind of lens through which you can do it. So one of the things that Dr. Carson was known for was being able to complete a cesarean section in 14 minutes. I am not a gynecologist or obstetrician, but that sounds really, really impressive to me. But you can see that these class photos, this is what I'm talking about. They are on the walls across all around Michigan Medicine. All of the class photos are there for us to interact and engage with. It's fabulous. It's fabulous. But one of the reasons I think these erasures and silences persist is because there's no context. There's nothing connecting to it. You would have to do a lot of work. For me, it's fun. For Andrew, it's fun. We love going to the Bentley and spending hours looking at these things. But we could think about how the institution might also help enable that, so that it doesn't have to just become an individual act of somebody being interested, but rather a way that we can think about our narratives. So this is another, this story, and I just have to say that we have Brian here, who I know is instrumental in helping to make these narratives known in Michigan. And so we have Nurse Marjorie Franklin and Dr. Helen Loretta. And so both of these women were firsts in terms of coming to Michigan and having to fight for access to space, having to fight for access to dormitories where people said, well, we don't really have space for you here, so let's create this other space. When Nurse Franklin came, she was 17 years old. She had to get her mother involved. They threatened to bring a lawsuit and took it to the regents, 17 years old. Eventually, they gave in. The regents and the dean of women's students gave in and said, "Okay, we don't want to fight this." And I'm really flattening that history, by the way. So if you want to know, all you got to do is Google her. There's fabulous material connected to these women and their stories. Whereas the second one, you have the house on Ann Street. And right now, if any of you park by Michigan Medicine, it's the Glen parking structure. So it's pretty easy to erase a history when the entire structure of the house that was basically the dormitory for Black women, and not just the dormitory, but a place of community, a place where people came together. It might not have started that way, but it certainly became that way. And there's nothing to signify it. We have our websites, which are fabulous, and I would just love to be able to see some of this history more broadly. Dr. Remus Grant Robinson. So this, I bring up his story because I think all of our medical students, all of our Michigan graduates are fabulous. But something about his story just highlights the challenges that Black physicians had, that they were able to graduate from Michigan, an elite and fabulous institution that had excellent technology, access to the most current innovations, and then they weren't able to practice in an institution that might have served white patients, because Black men, certainly, and Black women couldn't work on white patients, and they certainly couldn't tell white nurses what to do. Now, the reverse could be true. So this was one of the propagators of a segregated system, that in order for Black medical professionals to have access to the training that they needed to be board certified, they had to be in Black hospitals. And so he challenged this. Throughout his entire career, he stayed in Detroit, and he ultimately became, I think, chief of surgery at Parkland. He was also on the Board of Education. So this is another component that I think we don't often talk enough about, that the kinds of things that our medical graduates are doing just are far and wide. They are so involved in all kinds of things that are not just connected to the actual practice of medicine. They're seeing the interconnections. And Dr. Yancey, so this is who I mentioned earlier, who said that one of the objectives that Black medical students should always have is to never take no, because he was told no when he applied to Michigan, and he kept on and kept on and kept on. He went to the then dean at the medical school. And ultimately, one of the things I love about Dr. Yancey's story is that he ended up, he did his work here at Michigan, but then he went south. And one of the things that I love that he did, so he's a Black surgeon. So there are wonderful compilations about Black surgeons, and part of that was that there were so few of them. So on one hand, you get to read them because there were so few, but one of the things that he did is he went to areas of the Mississippi Delta, and he began working with people in those communities, incredibly poor people that had no access to healthcare, that definitely couldn't go to any kind of urban center, and certainly not any kind of center that was serving predominantly white folks. And he started teaching them about ways they could take care of themselves. And so this is the foundations that set up these community-based health centers along the Mississippi Delta. And this is a Michigan graduate. Community-based healthcare is fantastic. And once one of the things I noticed in the archives is, as more Black students started coming, especially around the mid-'60s, we started seeing curricular shifts that also included community-based healthcare. So I'm going to say that there was likely some agitation around that as well, which you can find in some of the student publications. And here's the next level. So you have folks who are staying in their communities and doing incredible things. You have folks who are going into other communities and empowering and doing what people would call racial uplift at that time. And here you have somebody who didn't see himself as an activist. He came to Michigan. He did what he needed to do. He went back down south, which is a lot of people did go, and because they wanted to work at Howard or Meharry, and also that's where they were able to work. But there was a lot of pride in it. And one of his patients had a lawyer. He was in a dispute. And when Dr. Eaton went to testify, there were two Bibles. And he describes it. You can see. He says, and pardon the language that he uses, but one each had a strip of dirty adhesive tape on them. One was labeled colored, the other white. Segregated Bibles. And then he continues, back at my office, I got out of my car a different Hubert Eaton, and he ended up becoming an activist, part of that. And so I think that's also very interesting because you just never know when it will seat for someone, and this was his moment, and he shares with us what this moment is. But it's an important part of who he was as a physician. So look at this, more policies. These are going to take us up into the 1960s, where I kind of will leave off. And if any of you know Dr. Richard Smith, who was also a medical graduate, he was instrumental in setting up the Black Medical Association while he was here. I believe he's giving a historical talk tomorrow. He might even be online. You should definitely see it because he'll talk directly about his own experiences, which he lived. So it'll be a great talk, I'm sure of it. So I want to now move into what do we do with this? This is a lot, right? This is a lot of information. And as I told you all before, I'm an educator. So I come to this work because I was teaching courses in the history of race and racism in medicine. My specialty is the history of race, and specifically the history of racialized violence in the foundations of social institutions, education being what I worked on my dissertation, and now the institutions of medicine. And one of the things I always do with my students is take them on these kind of roving discourses where we explore the spaces. And it started in part, remember I mentioned Jamon Jordan, the Detroit city historian. He's also a professor here. He's fabulous, his stories are incredible, and he does a lot of walking tours. So when I moved to Michigan, I kind of just followed him on every tour. I probably have done about 25 of his tours, some of them multiple times. He's fabulous. And he just made me think about the power of being able to engage in the space in order to understand who we are, where things come from. And so when I would teach teachers in Detroit, we would do historical tours. And it would really solidify something in them about how the space of the city is connected to the development of the education and is then influencing how they're engaging with their students. So this is similarly coming into play with medical students. I was thinking, how do we help medical students? And like I said, some of what we see in the medical school is fabulous. It just gave me raw material all day. And one of those pieces of raw material are the infamous Robert Thom paintings. There's somebody in this audience who has done this tour with me, and it's just so fabulous to see these paintings. They are problematic in a lot of ways. They certainly tell a specific kind of history, a history that was created by Park. It was the precursor to Pfizer. So this is a pharmaceutical campaign that contracted a brilliant artist, Robert Thom, who's from Grand Rapids, to paint these paintings. He painted so many in the course of about 10 years. He traveled to the places, he selected his models, and he represented these moments in medical history. And they are on the walls all throughout the medical school and even in some parts of the hospital. And part of what's fabulous about them, I think, is they do represent a particular snapshot. These are painted in the 50s. And I think some of the narratives and understandings of the 50s are seeping into how the history is told. And so, for example, this one, the one that is all the way to the left-hand side is showing anatomy, and in particular a cadaver. And you probably can't see it that clearly, but it is a woman cadaver. And it's interesting to think about what was it like in the 1600s for cadavers? Where would cadavers come from? Cadavers are taboo. You don't give your body to science unless you're a ward of the state or prostitute or perhaps a prisoner of war. So it's very likely that she was some collection of those. And you wouldn't know that to look at it. You would just think, oh, the surgical theater, this is kind of interesting. Most students tell me they don't even look at it. They just walk on by because they've got their exam to pass. But this is part of it. So I do wonder if you keep images like this up on walls and don't engage folks in them, what might people be taking from them? Are we a little bit like our AI tool, that we take in a bunch of inputs and then we use those inputs and don't think too much about them to represent what medical history is? There are only 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 paintings that actually represent folks of color in some capacity. Only one that represents Black women. It's pretty infamous, and if any of you were here last week, that painting was recently donated to Michelle Browder, fabulous and incredible artist and human who is in Alabama, and she has created a new museum that is about the mothers of gynecology. So reframing this story so that it's not about the father, James Marion Sims, of gynecology, who did all of these experiments on these enslaved girls. Most of them were 16 or 17. And so we, Michigan, donated this, and that took a lot of work, years of advocacy, years of talking back and forth. If any of you know about the gifts of art, it is a very political process, but it was right, and it's right that it's going to be there, and if you're ever in Alabama, May 10th, the museum opens, you should go and check it out, and then check out the Legacy Museum while you're there. All right, so this is just to give you a snapshot of this, and this is where I'm about to wrap up, is just to show you that, I don't know that you really need to see all of this, but this is as I walk into the medical. So I created this digital companion that was sponsored in part by a grant through the Inclusive History Project, and this is part of what you'll see. This is going to go away, though, however. The medical school has decided that they're going to create a mural, and they have contracted somebody to create a mural, and they're asking for student input. And so it's another component, I think, of institutional history, that things that are there sometimes no longer are there. And what happens then? Are we just done with that moment in our lives when we had a particular kind of narrative up on the walls? And so I always like to come back to, this is one of my favorite quotations, it's just about the power of stories. And perhaps some of you might be thinking about that just through our little experiments that we did together. But the stories do matter, because they can empower, they can humanize, they can break dignity, but they can also repair broken dignity. And also because I think today was really hard. I don't know about some of y'all who got some news today. My job certainly is no longer around as an instructor of the history of race and racism in medicine. It's probably not surprising, but I'm going to keep doing these kinds of things anyway. But I wanted to share with you Barbara Ransby's work. She is fabulous. She is a graduate here. She took on Juderstat when she was an activist and a student. And she penned this letter in 2021, 50 years into the future. And I love it because she is doing something that is so powerful in the Black radical tradition, and that is the power of imagining a future that you may or may not see, but you're always planting the seeds and you're always working towards. And so she starts the letter. We write to you from the east coast of Turtle Island. The landscape and built environment look different now. You would not even recognize it. There are accessibility paths and green areas everywhere. The earth can breathe and everyone can move freely, no matter how they move. Now, I think there's probably a health and another word after that you could use to describe how she's describing this, but notice she doesn't use the words. She's using these literary forms to describe a world that is better 50 years into the future. And here's how she ends it, and I love this. To build a new future is as much about memory as imagination. Day by day, we're making the impossible possible, then daring to dream even bigger. And I think that's why I get so excited about this history, because it is connected to imagining a better future. And so with that, I just want to thank you all for being here with me tonight. And that's it.
Thank you for that. That was really great. That was really fascinating. I will say that in answer to your question, there was not a picture taken out of the advertisement. Our wonderful social media person, Madeline Bradford, added a little outline of a person to that. But, I'll let her know that you liked it. But I have a couple questions for you. As the host, I'm going to take advantage of my power to do that. Yes. And one of the first questions I have is, what are some of the reactions you've had when you've taken people on these tours? Are they mostly medical students, or?
Y'all, I'm so excited to answer this question. So yes, I have taken medical students. I have since taken medical students, faculty, staff, best friends. I've taken legislators. I've taken incredible scholars. Oh yeah. I don't know why people just want to go. It's probably because I have a partner who's really good at connecting everybody to me, and then I just show up. But people really enjoy it, and I think part of the enjoyment is, now granted, we're talking about heavy stuff. It's hard. It's violent history. It's about racism and wrongs. But the things that tend to inspire us to do better are the hard things. And so part of what I think the tour does is brings people together in community to talk about things using the built environment, the art, and the artifacts that are around us. And perhaps there are some folks in the audience who could comment on that because they've actually been on the tour.
Well, I have to ask in a couple minutes, and just because, yeah, no, that sounds. I kind of wish I had a chance to take one.
Let's do it.
I think the Bentley would be very interesting. As I look towards Brian.
Let's do it.
We'll be in touch.
Excellent.
Now, this next question I have is, so the medical school is, obviously a very prominent. Michigan Medicine is, budgetarily probably overshadows everything else. It's a huge complex. But do you have a sense of how sort of these omissions and hidden histories of the medical school, how similar or different do you think those are to the university as a whole?
Yes, I think that is a really important question, some of which is connected to what I think is a function of time. So I think some of the early history of Michigan Medicine I just love because it is central to the development. But I think if I polled folks in here and asked folks if they've been to Michigan Medicine to just look around, that's not really the normal thing to do. And so there is a distinction that's happening. And from the stuff that I am looking at as I start, I'm thinking about narratives as I'm going through institutional history. So these are bulletins, these are development materials to attract donors, alumni, et cetera. There becomes a moment where you can clearly see the business side starting to flow in a very particular kind of way. I mean, the bulletins were always showing money being spent for the hospital. But around the early 1900s into the 1920s, you start to see a different perspective around the business aspect of the hospital. And I think, I wonder, perhaps that's also connected to it. Michigan Medicine brought in a lot of money to do some really interesting things. So I can't answer everything about that, but I do wonder. I also think that there is something about the profession of medicine and the development of it as elite, as particularly knowledgeable men of silence that was very important to who was a doctor. And I think some of that was challenged when you had women and people of color trying to enter the hallowed spaces that were medical institutions. And you can see this when you look at, for example, physicians who are writing in medical journals in the 1800s, the 1830s. And many of them are exploitative. They are learning their medical knowledge on black bodies. The history of this is wild and violent. And for example, Samuel Cartwright. And he is known for creating this condition called drapetomania. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. And it's a condition that he said was a medical condition when slaves decided that they wanted to run away. Because heaven forbid, somebody is chained and want their freedom. And you call it a medical condition. But these are, I offer this, it sounds like it's an extreme example, but it wasn't so extreme. It wasn't so exceptional that people were creating who they were as professionals, as holders of knowledge, by claiming some kind of understanding of black bodies, especially in the South during slavery. But this does not abstract other states that weren't part of the Southern Confederacy as also contributing to this. So I think there is something very interesting in the professionalization of medicine and medical doctors and scientific knowledge, and the connection to what's knowable and the Industrial Revolution. And we see some parallels of that for education, but education was never quite taken as seriously as medicine.
As in the, sort of the education of educators, or sort of education more broadly, just to make sure I understand? 'Cause I think
Yes, educators of, yes. So like around the same time, for example, of an education, the development of education as a discipline, something we could study and learn, took on this techno-rational understanding that if you put in a certain number of hours, you could develop minds in this kind of way. And it was very much the purview of these white Protestant men, and they had this virtuous outlook. And so when I'm in the archives and I'm looking at what the leaders and the presidents and the presidents and the deans, who are the early presidents and deans of the medical school in Michigan broadly, they're using very similar kinds of ways of thinking about men. We have to do this, and we have to do this now. It's moral, and it's right, and it's science, and it's observable. And they're putting this together, especially in the sort of 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. And that's an interesting set of parallels that I look forward to exploring a little bit more.
Yeah, because that's, I really want to dive into that. I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but I want to ask about something else, because I threatened to ask you about this, so I have to
here we
ask you this. So, you talked about, particularly in the mid-19th century, this sort of growth of, the quote-unquote man of science, the rise of science along with industrialization. In the 1870s, U of M opened a homeopathic hospital, which is a sort of pseudo-scientific doctrine that believed in treating diseases by exposing patients to things that would make a healthy person sick. And U of M only opened this hospital because the legislature said, if you don't open it, we're going to stop sending you money. So they didn't really want to do it, but it lasted 50 years until the 1920s. And so I'm kind of curious, and now is not something U of M really likes to boast about, I don't think. But have you found any sort of African Americans or black medical students who attended that? And this sort of, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this sort of double erasure with both African American medical students and this whole school that the university would probably, just as soon forget.
Yeah. I mean, it was a hot fight. It was a hot fight. The allopathic, or the regulars, medical schools, and the homeopathic, or the irregulars, the eclectics, if you will. And there are these wild cartoons that show them kind of fighting with each other. And interestingly, if you look what the patients are doing, they're silently dying. So I think there's a sense from the patients that neither really know what they're doing quite yet, which I think is interesting, because Michigan medicine would position the homeopathic in one kind of way, institutionally, in these early journals. But yes, one of the first black women graduates, which was 1878, graduated from the homeopathic hospital. And one of the things, I knew you were going to ask this, and so I was looking and brushing up, trying to see what I could find. I was actually surprised, and this would be my own bias, to see how many men were interested, and how it became more feminized over time.
The homeopathic?
The homeopathic, yes. And so as I heard it described, it's treating like with like. So for example, if you have allergies and it makes you cry, what else makes you cry? Well, onions make you cry. So perhaps the treatment for this is to give you some onions. You eat some onions, and that's going to stop you from your allergies. So this is the kind of ethos, so like a way of describing what homeopathic medicine was. And for these men of science who, I think another thing I really just love about the 19th century is that these institutions, these innovations, are being developed in tandem with understanding difference, with understanding space. We're talking about cities that didn't have sewage treatment facilities yet. So people are trying to understand, how do you do this while also being treated as an expert. And I just think it's fascinating. So once again, I took the academics route and did not quite answer your question, but I do think it was something that appealed to black medical professionals, in part too because perhaps some of the ethos was different. There was an ethos of caring that was different than the ethos perhaps of pathologizing, of seeing the patient as a problem as opposed to seeing the patient as a human. Again, kind of an interesting, I mean, if we think about today, there are some interesting parallels that people try to do it, but it was definitely described by many people in the medical school as quackery. I know people tried to shut it down. And interesting, this was another another area where it was agitated. So people fought to have the school, which I just think is fascinating. So it, like you said, it lasted 50 years side by side, these homeopathic educations.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like I always tell myself, someday I'm just going to dive into those records. And
You should. You should.
But I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up to other people, I promise. But I'm kind of curious. So I was really struck by the chart you showed where early sort of white, predominantly white institutions, U of M was second in terms of medical schools behind Harvard. And I imagine that's sort of the last couple of decades of the 19th century. But I'm curious, have you seen any patterns of where African-American medical students at U of M are coming from? Were they mostly from Michigan? Were they from sort of all over? You mentioned, I forget who it was who was from Detroit, or sorry, from Philadelphia, a Philadelphia family.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the larger question you're asking is why are they coming to Michigan, right?
That's,
why
that's probably a better way of putting it.
Yeah, why Michigan? Why Michigan? And I think, well, number one, Michigan does a very good job at promoting itself as an excellent institution. And people want to go to where things are excellent. Our first two graduates, Dr. Jones and Dr. Fitzbutler, both of them were coming from Canada. So some of that is connected to proximity. Dr. Jones, she was the first black woman. I believe there's a new book being written about her. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. But she wasn't able to get into medical school in Canada. So, you know, Canada, definitely there's a narrative we have about Canada, right? A narrative that people were fleeing. And they were. This narrative is rooted in what was happening. And Canada had some of the same kinds of challenges. She couldn't get into a medical school there, and so she came here. She came to Michigan, where they accepted a black woman. And so I think there's also this idea that if you can persist and push, you can persevere and make things happen. Now, also you have this time that I think we probably don't talk enough about but this class difference. And so perhaps some of you have heard about the talented 10th. So this idea that there is kind of a 10th of the population. This was something that Du Bois talked about, that these people were more talented. They could see and understand and do things, and so they had responsibilities, and they had responsibilities to go and be excellent. And I think that in my experience of looking at black doctors, including some who did not come to Michigan, like, for example, Ocean Sweet, they believed they were part of something grander. And for many of them, that was true. They did incredible things. So some of it, so I would say proximity, I would say means, they had some kind of access. I also think the role of philanthropy was important and connections to, for example, the Rockefeller Center and the Rosenwald School. So white philanthropists who had different connections to areas where they might have been came to Michigan. I didn't find, not yet, I didn't find. Just so you know, when I looked, so the African American Student Project, y'all, is fabulous. It's a database that you can go and you can search all of the students and you can see what they were doing. Incredible work. You all have just done such incredible work. So I did a little searching and I found about 378 or 376 medical students. And this means they either graduated or came to the University of Michigan. 73 of them were women. So I am working with Dr. Smith has been sending me information, Dr. Richard Smith, who I mentioned earlier, about who these folks are, because that's enough. I mean, you could really find out who some of these stories are, and people have. The Bentley has a great book about African American graduates, medical student graduates. So I think that would be an interesting question to pose about why, because some of the facts that we have is just birthplace and where did they go and where did they intern. But the next question is, well, what are more about their stories? Who are their families? Where are they going? I think that would be a fabulous project.
Yeah, I mean, we have this information, but that's not a story. There's a story behind that information.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That'd be a really fantastic project.
Agreed.
But for now, though, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to open it up to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our docents will bring you a microphone. Please wait till you have a microphone so those watching online can hear your question. So I'm going to open the floor.
actually my alarm going off reminding me to remind two of my children to take their medicine. So I figure it's on topic.
It is. Good job.
But you did a wonderful job of sharing with us how the racial narrative either impacted access to or the quality of education or the experience of doctors in the past. If we assume that that racial narrative still exists today, which I believe it absolutely does, how do you think that correlates then to patient care and the racial narrative actually impact how doctors, regardless of their own racial background, are actually interacting and caring for patients?
Yeah. Oh, it sounds like she's asking a question about healthcare equity. Absolutely. So this is, there are over at least 500 research studies that investigate this very kind of thing. One of the things that we know is that health outcomes for African Americans are better when they are treated by African Americans. This is something that is also similar in education. And part of that is, the next question is why? Why? What is it about that? And part of this is, I think, not the only, but a part of it is, if you don't care about the people you treat, or if you have a narrative about who you think these people are, it comes out. And that's why I think one of the reasons that Michigan Medicine and many medical institutions focused on on bias training, that we have biases and we need to recognize them so that we can work through them. And one of the things that we have learned with all of this, I do appreciate recognition of bias. I appreciate the practice that goes into it. But a single training is not going to stop my biases from happening. And so one of the things that we have learned is that sustained time together, learning collectively, is actually one of the most powerful ways that we can do that. So what does that mean? That means that if you are trying to overcome racial bias solely all by yourself, and that you think you're going to do it, it's very likely that you're just going to end up reproducing the very thing you're trying to intervene on. You need people, you need community, you need thought, and when I think there are ways we can do that. I also think there's an element of reparative and restoration. Like, if we make a mistake, we talk about it and we work through it. Some people would call that restorative justice. But in effect, it's a way of understanding that we are all raced. I got up here and talked about what was happening in Michigan Medicine. I focused on Black students, but I'm also part of that. I'm white. I also carry a race. I think that's another one of those narratives that when people think of race, there might be a color that becomes associated with that term. And so all of those things, I think, connect to healthcare outcomes. What we also know, though, is that race, independent of income, independent of gender, independent of nationality, has impacts on healthcare. So the idea that you can just, give more money, although sometimes money is definitely helpful, but that's going to be the thing that does it, it won't. And I'm borrowing a lot from Dr. David Williams, and if you all don't know who Dr. David Williams is, he's brilliant. He used to be at University of Michigan. Yeah, University of Michigan is pretty amazing, right? Like, we just have a lot of incredible people who've come through here. But he has done tons of work, and you can watch some of his stuff. And I'm happy to give suggestions for more of the contemporary healthcare equity research. Yes, but last point I'll make, because I'm actually working on a study right now that's investigating these kinds of ways that we can sustain institutional efforts that, of course, are being thwarted by what we are not allowed to say, by people being afraid to even talk to us so that we can learn from them and their experiences, is that no one segment of anybody can make these kinds of things happen. So in other words, some of the most successful things happen because you have leadership who are willing to take a stand to do things. You have some grassroots who are willing to do it, and you have people who are also doing the work in between. And that takes coalition, that takes solidarity, that takes the kinds of things that that some of us like to call too radical to do. But that's because they work. That's because change is powerful. And yeah, I want to imagine a better world where we can do that. So if you want to do it, yeah, this is recorded, right? It's going to be online on YouTube. I'm ready for it. Dana!
Yep.
Wait for that microphone.
So good evening. I am curious about erasure.
Yes.
And so you started talking about narratives, and narratives change. And we've had a lot of narratives in the last 5 years, the last 8 years or so. And so the narrative at University of Michigan is about to change. After the email that went out today, the message around what's going to happen with these verboten words that are happening in our society. So, what is the recommendation as an institution that is in this pivotal moment of change that is not necessarily all of their own doing? How do we retain and not lose track of that history so the things that have been accomplished and the great work that has been done
Yeah.
and the great people behind that work
Yes.
don't get erased?
Yes. Yes. I love this question. I love this question because I think one of the things that I reflect on with the 1960s civil rights, 1950s, 1960s civil rights era, is that there were, I'm going to give you a corollary example. So there were a lot of people who were very fed up with the kind of treatment that they were seeing, the racism, the poverty, and people were also coming together with solidarity. So you had people taking buses from areas up here and going down to the south, and they were working with communities down there, often in these medical capacities. And each of them were doing it not necessarily thinking that they were part of something bigger, larger, grander, or even connected. And what happened was kind of like recycling, that all of these pockets of people were doing these things, and they were all doing it at the same time, and therefore it had a huge impact. It had a huge impact. Now we reverse it. And right now you have people who I think are legitimately worried about backlash, about funding. And so they're thinking perhaps, I'm not in the minds of these folks, but I'm postulating that if we do it, we're going to protect ourselves. We're going to be okay. But then you have everybody else who's also doing that, and now it's coming together and it's making the problem really big. So I think that's why history is awesome, because you can see these parallels and you can ask these kinds of historical questions to see how they might be playing out in what we need to do. Something that Dr. Angela Dillard, who's fabulous, reminded us recently was during the Red Scare, which I saw is open over there, fabulous, this Red Scare, you can read a little bit about it at U of M. When the leadership had the Red Scare, one of the tactics they decided to do was to just give in a little bit. Like, we're just going to throw a couple people under the bus, just turn in a couple of faculty members, and then, they'll leave us alone. Did that happen? Absolutely not, because this is tyranny. And tyranny doesn't work like that. Tyranny likes more tyranny. Violence begets violence, tyranny begets tyranny. Peace begets peace. It's amazing, it's amazing. So I think that if we continue to operate in the current structures that we are operating in, where, I don't know what it's going to look like when I say this and people look at it, but if what we care about is funding, because people got to be paid, right? But I think there are ways that you could adjust funding models. I think you could think about it a little bit more cooperatively. You could give it a go. You could read Grace Lee Boggs, fabulous. She's from Detroit. She had a lot to say on that. She's brilliant. You could think about how to do it in a way that could counter what's happening. But it would require will, it would require leadership, and it definitely would require courage. And it might require that you have somebody on speed dial to get you out of jail, just in case you do something and somebody don't like it. And so that's another part of it. These risks are real. And one of the papers that maybe I'll write one day when I have lots of time is to think about the role of fear in erasure. So one of the things I noticed when I mentioned the riots that happened that destroyed Dr. McCune Smith's orphanage. And one of the things that happened, a lot of people saw this mob violence. They weren't engaged in it, but they were afraid of it. And one of the things that happened is when black people came and asked for help, they were like, nope, because if I help you, they're going to come after me. And I think it's that kind of fragmentation, that kind of I'll be safe if, Y'all, I'm not saying anything new. There are so many people who have said this kind of thing, right? If you come after one, somebody else can come after. Our struggles are connected. Our oppressions are connected. Similarly, our liberations are connected. And so I don't believe it's just a pie in the sky. I think it takes work. I think people who have done it in the past over and over know it takes work. And it's dangerous work. But so is living under tyranny. So I don't know, take your pick. Clear, y'all, I'm so upset about this email today. Do you see the cheek? This is going on the record. I don't mind because I think it's okay to be a little fired up about this stuff, right? It matters. It matters in a big way. And I was telling somebody, I think it's so fascinating that it's like now I'm living this history that I've been studying. You know, I study all these struggles and I'm thinking about it. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm in it. Ah! So I have a lot of empathy for having to make hard decisions. So I don't want to throw people under the bus. That was another thing Dr. Dillard pointed out, is that we also need to believe in our institutions. So throwing our leaders under the bus isn't necessarily helpful. So how can we work together? When I think about successful corporations that knew pay cuts had to come and leaders took a pay cut in order to make sure that everybody could survive, and people survived. Ooh, what a great model. I don't know, just saying. Are you regretting this yet?
Pardon? I think we have time for one more question if somebody wants to follow that. That really powerful.
I know, right? Don't give me a microphone.
All right. Well, I think then that's a really great way to end the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all
you
for joining us.
being here. Thank you.
Thank all of you for joining.
I'm married to. Or that's the best friend. Or the other.
So thank you for that wonderful talk, those wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining us. Thanks as well to Austin for monitoring the live stream. Thanks to our wonderful Michigan media team. Without this, this talk would never appear again, and my mother wouldn't be able to watch it. So thank you. Tonight's session will be available online in about a week, and will be shared with all of you who registered. I'll also send you a direct link if you'd like. Our next Making Michigan will be on April 10th, when we will be joined by several members of the Inclusive History Project's 1817 project, who will share with us the research into U of M's. No worries, I understand. They will be sharing with us their research into U of M's complex and complicated history, to put it mildly, with Native American communities. For those of you here at the observatory tonight, the original observatory building upstairs will be open until about 9. We have student docents to share things, the history, see the original 1850s telescope, and they do a really fantastic job. I highly recommend it. Do you think the weather's clear enough for viewing tonight? Okay, sounds like it's a bit too cloudy, but you can at least see the telescope. And for those of you who are watching online, please come visit us soon. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening. Thank you again. No, thank you. That was really great.